13 Love, I'm Shanore. I cover my head and dress modestly for spiritual reasons. I am also the owner of Ancestral Sister 913, where I do sell white head covers and shawls to help the righteous set themselves apart. And today we're talking about something of the sort, right? So why is covering even associated with holiness? Let's rap about that, right? And so I think the first thing is that when we're talking about covering as it relates to holiness, what we're talking about is essentially signs and symbols, right? And signs and symbols has been a primary form of communication since the beginning of time, right? It still is a very prominent form of language, right? And so when it comes to covering as it pertains to holiness, covering is also more of a visual language. When we're talking about head covering or covering your body and all the things, right? It's a form of visual language. It's an outward expression of our inner commitments and our inner convictions, if you will. It's a form of visual identity, and it really heavily speaks to the culture of a person or a people, right? You could tell a lot about someone's culture by what they are wearing, right? And so I think the two greatest examples of this would be your so-called Indians and then obviously the Moors, right? And so when we talk about the so-called Indians, unfortunately, I'm not talking about like that Mongoloid group or the Native Americans. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about your earliest so-called Indians, your copper-colored people, right? And so I guess the loose example I have about them is that, in my own words, one of the last things that pulled those so-called Indians, which are Moors, right? One of the last things that really pulled them out of their culture and away from their way of life is that they eventually started dressing like the invaders, right? Like we've seen those pictures where eventually they, initially they're in their natural cultural garments and, you know, the feathers and, you know, all the things, a little skirt, like you know what they wore, right? That tribal clothing essentially, right? At first they look like that, but then eventually they're dressing like John Former and, you know, Steve, you know, Copenhagen or whoever these people were that would have invaded the so-called Indians, right? So you then eventually see the so-called Indians wearing slacks and button downs and a little top hat or like a three-piece suit kind of thing. You know what I'm saying? Like eventually they were dressing like the invaders, which definitely would have pulled them away from their culture. And if we didn't have instruments that can teach us or link us to the history of peoples, you wouldn't know that, okay, this is a so-called Indian man that's no longer in his cultural garb. You know what I'm saying? So that's one example. And then as for the Moors, my word for the Moors, there's a very popular quote from a Adam Weishaupt, allegedly this Adam Weishaupt, whoever. It's really your George Washington. I don't know. You look it up. You let me know. Okay. But there's a very prominent quote where he is explicitly saying, well, if we could just get the Moors essentially out of their cultural clothing, out of their turbans, out of their head covers, out of their sandals, if we remove that cultural identity, then we can actually make them over time forget their truest identity, right? And so to pull someone away from their cultural clothing, because the culture is in the clothing, you know? So to pull someone away from their cultural clothing is to pull them away from who they really are and away from their ways and customs. And so if we're talking about covering and why does covering equate to holiness? Well, if you pull someone away from the garb that the Creator deems holy, which is head covering and covering your body, etc., to pull someone away from that would take them away from what the Creator says is good and is holy. And that's one of the major points here is that covering your head, covering your body, this is what the Creator deems as holiness, right? This is what the Creator deems as holiness. This is what the Creator deems as your spiritual garb, your spiritual protection, your spiritual uniform. That's why it's related to holiness overall. And then I think we have to think about this, right? So to be holy, right? Why is covering connected or equated to holiness? Well, holiness is to be set apart, is to be divine, to be living and walking that life of righteousness. Holiness is to be set apart, is to be distinguished from the common people, right? Is what I like to call them, from the common folk, right? And so in order to do that, we have to be set apart as holy people. And covering our heads, covering our bodies, covering your faces. This is what the Creator, this is what Hashem, this is what so-called God, this is what the Most Highest Elohim, universal creators, has deemed as holy, right? That's why it's related to holiness. But then you also can look at it like this: spiritual, mental, physical, right? And so if you're covering your head and covering your body, you're storing up that spiritual energy, right? So that's one check for the physical, cool, right? And then you move on to your mental, right? If you got that head cover, right, that helps you to be covered mentally also. But then when you're just feeding your brain good things, right? And doing what you have to do to stay insane, inside of your sanity versus being outside of your sanity, right? You're doing what you need to do to stay insane. Then you got your checks for the mental, right? You're reading good books, you're watching good things on your so-called TV or your phone, or you're just doing good by your mental, okay, cool. You got your mind fixated on the Most High. So you have your mind fixated on righteousness, okay? So you got yourself covered mentally, cool, check for mentally, right? And then for spiritually, you're saying your palils or your so-called prayers. You're in communion with the Creator. You're taking those steps toward the Most Highs and allowing them to take those steps towards you. You're going out in nature. You're connecting spiritually. Okay, great. You got those checks on the mental, spiritual, and the physical as far as covering, right? And I guess the point I'm making is like, it's two spectrums. You only got two spectrums. Like you only got two kinds of people in this world. So if you're doing what you got to do on the mental, spiritual, and physical end, you're doing what you have to do. You're doing what the Creator has advised us, commanded us to do, and taking care of yourself mentally, spiritually, physically, covering yourself mentally, spiritually, physically. Well, if you got two ends of the spectrum and you're doing what the Most High has commanded you to do, well, you damn sure that won't lead you to the side of wickedness. It can only lead you to the side of righteousness and holiness. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, why does covering equate or equal to holiness? Because we are doing, you see what I'm saying? You are doing what the Most High has commanded, which in its own way has a lot to do with storing ourselves up. Okay, now we're going somewhere, right? Because it has a lot to do, those spiritual, mental, physical things has a lot to do with preserving ourselves and preserving our souls, right? Spiritual, mental, and physical covering. It's a form of preservation. And so it's like, I think a lot of people forget that, we are working and striving and walking to get back to a place. And in order to get back to that place, we have to be in a certain kind of shape, if you will. And I think the perfect example of this is, so our Honorable Rabbi Apostle Nine Son Amaru Bey of TLC 13 Love Community, so he had our Mama Kim share a video a couple years back. It was an audio video of Dick Gregory, and he was basically making this analogy about going to heaven, about going back to a place and what it takes to get there. And I'll kind of paraphrase that audio, but basically he was saying, I'm paraphrasing here, right? So let's say like all the children are at mama's house, right? All the children are at Big Mama's house, Big Mama's house. Eventually what Big Mama gonna do, Big Mama gonna kick all the children out the house. Everybody go outside and play children, right? Because Mama has to restore the home. Mama has to restore her queendom, if you will, right? Get your asses outside. Cool. Go play, right? Mama expects you to go outside to play, have fun, learn things, be of help, get your lesson on all the things, right? Cool. Go be a child. Do your thing. Eat some mud pies or something. That's your business. But when it's time to come back in the house, okay? When it's time to come back in Big Mama's house, oh, well, see, I know you went outside and did your little mud pie thing. You know, I ain't mad at you. But you can't trick the mud back in Big Mama's house. You can't come back in Big Mama's house with your dirt and your filth, right? You can't come back in you can't be dragging all that back in Big Mama's house. You got to be clean in order to go back into Big Mama's house. Is you picking up what I'm putting down. So we're going back to a place, and when it comes to covering, it's largely about restoration, preservation, because we have to be clean in order to get back. In order to get back to Mama, in order to get back to the Most High's Elohim, universal creators. And so I would like to beg, perhaps the question isn't just merely like, why do you cover, or why does covering equal holiness? If you think deeper on this thing, it's like, what are we really declaring sacred by doing so? By doing the covering? Who are we really declaring sacred by not being able to just trick mud through Mama's house and bring our filth in? What are we really declaring as sacred and holy by way of covering? Maybe that's the question. 13 Love, thank you for being here. Bye-bye. Let me know what you think. Bye-bye.